Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into the foggy alleys of the Middle Ages, where legends weren't just bedtime stories, they were survival guides. Imagine this, flickering torchlight on damp stone streets, shadows stretching longer than seems possible, and whispers carrying names you'd really rather not hear. You feel that familiar tug between curiosity and dread, as if you're opening a door you already know you shouldn't. And yet, here we are, leaning in closer. Honestly, if you were actually dropped into a medieval village right now, you probably wouldn't last through dinner without catching a plague or angering the wrong priest. You'd be toast, literally and figuratively. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below with your location and the time right now. I love seeing where in the world and at what hour. We're creeping through history together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle along muddy cobblestones, the cold seeping up through your shoes, and the silence feels heavier than it should. Everyone knows this era is called the Dark Ages, but in truth the darkness isn't just the lack of candlelight. It's the stories, the legends, the terrifying whispers that clung to people's lives. You hear about the wailing nun locked forever in her convent, the cursed crown that doomed kings, the forests where no one dared collect firewood because of the hanging dead. These tales weren't dismissed as fiction. They were warnings, shaping the way you walked home, the way you prayed, even the way you dreamed. What's wild is that historians still debate how much of this was real. Were there truly ghostly armies marching in the skies? Or were villagers just staring too long at storm clouds? Were cursed objects genuinely feared? Or just political excuses to dethrone unlucky monarchs? You feel the tension in every version, the mix of human imagination, superstition, and just enough coincidence to make even skeptics bite their nails. As you wander deeper into this first night of stories, you realize the scariest part isn't whether the legends were true, it's that people lived as if they were. Think of how seriously you take your Wi-Fi connection or your smoke detector. That's how much weight they gave to the bells tolling at midnight, or the sight of a dog with glowing red eyes. It wasn't optional. It was survival. And in that survival, whole communities became actors in a theater of fear. Every toll of the church bell, every unexplained death, every strange dream was interpreted through this lens of dread. The legends were their language, the way they processed chaos in a world they couldn't control. It makes you wonder, don't we do the same now, just with different monsters? You lean closer to the crackling fire of this story, heart beating a little quicker. Because tonight, we're not just learning history, we're stepping into its shadows where every whispered tale carries teeth. The air grows colder as you push open a heavy wooden door in your mind. Stepping into the cloister of a monastery that should feel safe but doesn't. The stones here don't just hold prayers, they hold secrets and the whispers about one nun who never left. She's called the Wailing Ghost, and her cry is said to echo through the halls at night, as sharp as the crack of ice splitting on a winter pond. You imagine walking barefoot over the cold flagstones, candle in hand, when suddenly that sound rolls through the darkness. It isn't a scream. It isn't a sob. It's somewhere in between, like someone trying to confess and choke at the same time. The legend goes like this. A nun fell in love, which in medieval terms was basically signing your own death warrant. Some versions say she broke her vows, others that she was falsely accused. Either way, she died within those stone walls, denied burial in consecrated ground, and so her soul never rested. Now she drifts through the convent, her veil trailing behind her like mist, wailing in endless grief. Kind of like the medieval version of being stuck in an eternal Zoom meeting, except instead of boredom, it's despair. Here's the strange twist historians argue about. The church records from the monastery mention sudden deaths, unexplained fires, even monks who claimed to hear voices in the night. Were they covering up scandals, or were they truly terrified of something otherworldly? Some scholars think the tale was spread to discourage nuns from straying, a morality play wrapped in ghostly moans. Others believe the locals genuinely thought they were dealing with a restless spirit. You picture yourself kneeling in the chapel, the flicker of oil lamps casting halos on the walls. The sisters chant, but their eyes flick nervously toward the shadows. Every sound is a maybe a draft, maybe a mouse, maybe her. The idea that the veil between the living and the dead is this thin makes you shiver. And the cruel part, people in the Middle Ages didn't shrug it off like a creaky pipe. They built their lives around it. If the ghost wailed near the cloister, they might fast, pray, or even move entire dormitories to escape her path. It's easy to laugh now, until you realize you'd probably do the same. If you heard something crying in a deserted church at midnight, would you honestly just roll over and say, "Hey, must be the wind"? Didn't think so. The wailing echoes in your ears, lingering as you step back into the night air. The monastery door creaks shut, and you're left with the unsettling thought that silence can be louder than sound. You carry the chill of the nuns' cries with you as the path winds toward a darker relic, a crown that gleams not with glory, but with ruin. Imagine a jeweled circlet sitting on a velvet cushion, its gold catching the candlelight in all the wrong ways, like a smile you don't trust. This isn't some fairy tale coronet. It's the cursed crown, the one whispered to bring death to any king foolish enough to wear it. Medieval rulers loved shiny hats, but this one was more of a medieval booby trap. The legend tells of a smith forced to forge the crown under duress. He was cheated of payment, beaten and left to rot. Before dying, he cursed his creation, pouring his rage into every hammered curve of gold. And so, when kings placed it upon their brows, disaster followed. Sudden illness, violent uprisings, even entire dynasties snuffed out quicker than a candle in the wind. Picture Game of Thrones, except with fewer dragons and more awkward coronations that ended badly. Here's the part that makes historians lean in. Several monarchs in the region did die mysteriously, after wearing a particular crown tied to the tail. Some collapsed at feasts, others in battle, one even in bed with his mistress, which, let's be honest, was not the vibe he was going for. Chroniclers recorded these deaths with ominous hints, never outright blaming the crown, but leaving enough breadcrumbs for a legend to sprout. Was it poison? A political setup? Or just medieval folks connecting dots because they loved a good scary story? Scholars still argue, because apparently debating jewelry is a valid academic pursuit. You picture yourself in the royal hall, banners swaying, the smell of roasted boar thick in the air. Trumpets blare as a new ruler steps forward, pride on his face. The crown descends, and for a heartbeat, the court holds its breath. Will it be triumph or doom? The tension is so sharp you could slice bread with it. And then days later, when the king stumbles and fails to rise, the whispers coil tighter. Another victim. Another curse confirmed. What's truly terrifying isn't just the crown itself, but the way belief fueled fear. People acted differently around it, avoiding it, murmuring prayers if they had to touch it, spinning rumors until the crown's power became larger than life. It didn't matter whether the curse was real. The dread was real, and it shaped kingdoms, and you? You probably wouldn't even try it on, not even for a medieval Instagram selfie. Because let's face it, no amount of likes is worth a mysterious case of sudden death by crown. The cursed jewels still glitter in your imagination as you step away from the hall, wondering if some relics should stay buried. But the night has more stories, and next, you'll find yourself at the mercy of the Black Huntsman. The cursed crown still lingers in your mind, but the wind outside shifts, carrying with it the sound of hounds baying across the night. You glance into the dark, and there he is, or so the stories insist, the Black Huntsman. Not the cheerful kind of hunter you'd meet in a fairy tale, but a shadowy figure, riding with a pack of spectral dogs whose eyes glow like coals. Picture a medieval version of Ghost Rider, minus the motorcycle, plus more fur and slobber. This legend stalked villages from the edge of Germany to the forests of England. They called him by many names: Der Schwarze Jäger, Hörner the Hunter, or just the Devil's Huntsman. Wherever he rode, crops failed, cattle sickened, and people disappeared. The sound of his horn wasn't a call to hunt. It was a death sentence. You imagine being a medieval peasant, trudging home after dark with a bundle of sticks, when suddenly the horn echoes through the woods. Goosebumps, not from the cold, but because you know if you run, you'll be running forever. The terrifying detail. Chronicles mention actual nights, when whole villages swore they saw a spectral hunt sweep past. A monk in the 12th century even wrote about seeing phantom riders filling the sky, their dogs snarling with fire. Was it a storm, a hallucination, or mass hysteria? Historians still debate whether this was superstition or some trick of weather and fear. One scholar even suggested it might have been a way to scare kids into staying inside after dark. Basically, medieval parenting with added nightmare fuel. But the huntsman wasn't just a phantom in the sky. Some tales say he punished oath-breakers and liars. Others claimed he hunted souls, dragging them into the forest where no prayer could reach. The scariest twist? If you made eye contact with him, he might mark you, not kill you immediately, but doom your family with years of misfortune. A sort of medieval tag, you're cursed. You picture yourself standing on a village road, torch in hand, when the sky above splits with the thunder of hooves. A rider cloaked in black surges past, dogs tearing at the mist, their howls scraping down your spine. The air reeks of sulphur and wet earth, and just as quickly as it begins, the vision vanishes. Only the echo remains, leaving you trembling, wondering if you've been marked. It's easy now to laugh, to think of ghost tours and Halloween costumes, but imagine being trapped in a world where the line between superstition and survival was razor thin. In a place without streetlights, where every rustle in the brush might be a wolf or something worse, the Black Huntsman was more than a story. He was the embodiment of every fear that stalked the night. And as you step away from the haunted forest, the echoes still chasing your heels, you sense another shadow creeping closer. This one isn't a phantom rider, but a woman whose very name turned men pale, the Blood Countess. The huntsman fades into the mist, but in his place rises a figure altogether more chilling, because she was flesh and blood, not phantom, Elizabeth Bathory, remembered in whispers as the Blood Countess. You might think vampires are creatures of imagination, but she is the reason why some legends feel too close for comfort. Imagine her castle, towering grey walls, perched in the Carpathian hills of Hungary, candles flickering in long corridors that smelled of beeswax and iron. Inside, noblewomen whispered of her beauty and her temper, while peasants muttered darker tales. She was said to lure village girls into her service with promises of work, only for them to vanish behind stone doors. Some versions say the walls themselves groaned with the screams of her victims. Romantic dinner date? Definitely not. The terrifying claim she bathed in blood to preserve her youth. Picture a marble tub, filled not with warm water but with crimson, the Countess stepping in calmly as if it were rosewater. That's the image that lingers in your brain. And honestly, it's the kind of skincare routine Sephora never put on their shelves for good reason. Yet historians still debate this. Did she truly commit such acts, or were the accusations magnified by political enemies eager to seize her wealth and lands? Some argue she was a cruel woman, yes, but the bathing detail was a later addition. Gothic exaggeration layered onto real brutality. Still, even without the gore, her record is grim. Witnesses swore they saw servants tortured, beaten, burned, or starved at her command. One chilling fact: a priest allegedly refused to ring the funeral bell for the endless stream of dead girls, saying it would toll every day and night if I obeyed. If that doesn't rattle your sleep, nothing will. You picture yourself as a villager summoned to the castle, clutching your shawl tight, praying your name isn't called. The corridors echo. The Countess glides past in a gown of indigo and gold, her eyes cold and appraising. Every step you take feels like a gamble. Will you serve at her table or vanish into the stone vaults below? And here's the cruelest irony. Elizabeth came from one of the most powerful families in Europe. Her relatives included kings and princes, yet even her noble status couldn't save her when the rumors swelled too large. She was eventually walled up in her own castle chamber, bricked in alive, left to rot in isolation, a fitting punishment or a political coup disguised as justice. Historians still debate that too. What lingers isn't just her cruelty, but the way her story fed centuries of fear. Gothic novels borrowed her legend, vampire tales drew from her shadow, and every whisper about blood-drinking aristocrats seems to trace back to her. You can almost hear the drip of candle wax in her silent chamber, the faint echo of nails scratching stone. As she realized her power had become her prison, the castle fades, but the shadows it cast remain, and from them emerges another legend, this time not of nobility, but of the road, the phantom monk who offers blessings that feel more like curses. The Countess's shadow retreats, but the road ahead is no less unnerving. You step onto a lonely medieval track, cobbled in places, muddy in others, lined by crooked trees that seem to lean in as if eavesdropping on your footsteps. Travelers whispered of many dangers here, bandits, wolves, even wayward knights looking for trouble. But one tale rises above the rest, the phantom monk of the crossroads. Picture this: a figure in a rough brown habit, Hood pulled so low that you can barely see a face, only the glimmer of something pale where eyes should be. He appears just as the mist thickens, when your candle lantern sputters, and the night air grows colder than your bones think possible. He raises a hand as if to bless you, but his fingers look too long, too thin, as though they've stretched from something not entirely human. That's the medieval version of a "do not disturb" sign. And yet you can't look away. Some claimed he was the restless ghost of a monk who'd broken his vows, condemned to wander until Judgment Day. Others swore he was a demon in disguise, testing travelers' faith. Either way, you didn't want him to touch you. Stories said those who bowed to receive his blessing found themselves sick within a week, their bodies wasting until nothing remained but skin clinging to bone. Medieval folks didn't have TikTok trends, but they sure knew how to make curses go viral. Here's an odd historical twist. Monastic chronicles occasionally mention wandering hermits, who turned out to be con men in disguise, using the cloak of holiness to beg or steal from passers-by. Could the phantom monk legend have been fueled by such tricksters? Some historians say yes, while others insist the sheer number of sightings across regions suggests something stranger at work. Either way, the story stuck. Imagine yourself trudging along with a sack of bread, hearing the toll of a church bell far off, yet there's no village nearby. The monk steps into your path, whispers Latin prayers that make no sense, and reaches for your forehead. Do you accept the touch, hoping for divine protection, or do you bolt into the woods, risking wolves and worse? Neither choice feels like winning. Even stranger, some tales claim the monk could predict death. If he stopped you and spoke your name, you'd be gone within a month. That's like bumping into a medieval fortune teller who only has one answer on repeat: you're doomed. Convenient for building suspense, not so great for your peace of mind. As you hurry down the road in your imagination, you feel the hair on your arms rise, like static before a storm. The monk doesn't chase. He doesn't need to. His presence lingers, following you like a cold afterthought, and when you finally stumble into the firelight of an inn, the warmth feels less like safety and more like borrowed time. The inn's chatter swallows you, but in the corner of the common room sits another unsettling figure, this one as real as history itself, the flagellant pilgrim, scourging himself in penance while townsfolk watch in uneasy silence. The warmth of the inn does little to ease the unease in your chest. You sit by the fire, but your gaze keeps slipping toward the far corner, where a lone figure kneels, his back bare and crisscrossed with welts. A whip dangles from his trembling hand. With each slow, deliberate strike, the leather cuts into his skin, blood welling like beads of rubies in the candlelight. He mutters prayers between ragged breaths, the Latin syllables rough as gravel. This is no tavern drunk trying to shock the crowd. He is a flagellant, one of the penitents who roamed the roads during plague years, convinced that self-inflicted suffering could turn God's anger aside. Imagine it. Entire processions of men stripped to the waist, marching barefoot through towns, chanting hymns and lashing themselves until the streets ran with their blood. It was medieval performance art, except the audience wasn't sure whether to clap or run away. The legend that grew around them was terrifying. People whispered that their whips carried plague rather than dispelled it, that their moans summoned demons in the night. In some towns, villagers joined in for a day, convinced it might save them from the Black Death. In others, authorities banned them, fearing their fervor spread panic faster than the disease itself. Historians still debate whether the flagellants were brave spiritual rebels or dangerous fanatics stoking hysteria. You picture the pilgrim lifting his whip again, eyes glazed, whispering that every lash brings him closer to salvation. But you can't help noticing how some in the inn lean forward, almost mesmerized, as if pain were contagious not just through touch, but through spectacle. That's the unsettling part. His agony feels staged for you. And you didn't buy a ticket. And here's the twist. Many of these processions carried not just whips, but banners painted with apocalyptic visions, dragons, angels, rivers of fire, images meant to terrify crowds into repentance. Medieval TikTok shock value, except instead of smash that like button, it was smash your back until heaven notices. As the pilgrim's whip cracks again, the inn falls silent. A dog whines and ducks under a table. The smell of iron from his wounds mixes with ale and smoke, clinging to your throat. You realize the real horror isn't the pain itself, but how easily suffering becomes a kind of theater. Something ordinary folk watch to remind themselves of their place in a punishing world. And just as you think you've had enough spectacle for one night, a gust rattles the shutters, and an old sailor at the next table begins whispering about what he once saw at sea, a ghostly ship, crewed by the damned, doomed to sail forever. The sailor's voice is rough as salt and smoke, and the firelight flickers across his weathered face as he leans closer, lowering his tone until the whole inn leans with him. He speaks of a night when the sea lay calm as glass, not a ripple stirring, when suddenly a black silhouette appeared on the horizon, a ship with tattered sails glowing faintly, as though lit from within by embers. No oars cut the water, no wind filled its canvas, yet it glided forward with eerie grace. The crew, he swears, were skeletons draped in rotted cloaks, their hollow eye sockets glimmering with pale fire. Some say they were sailors cursed for betraying their oath, condemned to wander until Judgment Day. Others whisper they were plague victims denied burial, their restless spirits binding themselves to a vessel so they might haunt the living. And the most chilling part? The ship was utterly silent, save for the groan of timbers that hadn't touched a dock in centuries. He tells you that villagers along the coasts passed down the warning: if you saw the ghost ship and heard it call your name, you'd be dead within the year. Some claimed they saw it hovering above the water, floating just beyond reach, like a nightmare stitched into the night sky. Even the bravest fishermen turned their boats inland, preferring famine over crossing its path. Historians still argue whether such tales sprang from Viking sagas, crusader nightmares, or simple drunken fancy of sailors, but the consistency of the stories across Europe keeps the hair prickling on your arms. You imagine yourself on a midnight shore, the tide pulling softly at your ankles, when suddenly that outline rises in the mist, sails shredded like cobwebs, deck crawling with figures that never sleep, and because your brain is annoying, you can't help but compare it to the medieval version of an unskippable horror trailer, except you don't get to walk away when it ends. The sailor chuckles dryly, but his eyes don't. He mutters that some who claim to see the ship also heard bells tolling from its deck, as though announcing a funeral in advance. And strangely, whenever such visions spread through a town, pestilence seemed to follow soon after, as though the ship itself carried sickness along the coastline. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe legend was the only language people had for terror too big to name. The inn goes quiet after his tale, the fire burning lower, until someone whispers about another terror of the Middle Ages, not from sea or sky, but from beneath the earth itself, the restless dead who refuse to stay buried. The hearth crackles, but you feel a chill creep in anyway, as though the floorboards remember what the sailor just said. Someone across the table clears their throat, and then the conversation turns downward, into the soil, into the grave, into the kind of stories that make you pull your blanket tighter around your shoulders. They begin to speak of revenants, the restless dead who clawed their way back into the world of the living. Unlike the modern movie-friendly vampire with a velvet cape, these medieval nightmares were far cruder, far more unsettling. Imagine a bloated, purpled corpse dragging itself out of the ground, eyes glazed, mouth slack, and reeking of decay. People swore they heard them scratching under the floorboards at night, or thumping against doors like unwanted visitors who never learned manners. The strangest part: these tales didn't come from just one place. England had its walking corpses, France spoke of revenants, and in Germany they called them Nachtseher, corpse chewers, who supposedly devoured their own burial shrouds before gnawing at the living. Historians still debate whether these were pure superstition or distorted memories of diseases like tuberculosis, where the sick wasted away so badly it seemed as though the dead were feeding on them from beyond the grave. Either way, the villagers believed every thump in the dark was something trying to crawl back in. So how did medieval folks defend themselves? Not with garlic or glittering stakes, but with some seriously unsettling rituals. Bodies were exhumed and decapitated, their heads buried between their knees. Some corpses had iron stakes driven through their chests, or large stones jammed into their mouths. Basically the medieval version of hitting the mute button on the undead. If your neighbor was suspected of being a revenant, it wasn't unusual for a crowd to march to the graveyard with shovels, convinced that the only way to restore peace was to mutilate the corpse. You picture it. A foggy night, villagers huddled around a half-dug grave, torches flickering, shadows leaping across the headstones. Then the moment of silence when the coffin cracks open, and all eyes stare at the body inside. Nails oddly long, lips bloody, a face bloated as if it had feasted in the earth. Someone screams, someone crosses themselves, and the priest mutters a prayer while another man raises the iron spike. It's gruesome, yes, but it was also catharsis. A way to take back control in a world that offered very little. And of course, you can't help but laugh softly at the absurdity. Medieval people basically invented the worst sleepover activity of all time, grave checking. Forget telling ghost stories. They went outside and dug them up just to be sure. Yet behind the dark humor lingers a real weight. Because whether revenants were real or not, the fear was. The sound of branches tapping a window, the creak of a door hinge, the thud of shifting earth, all of it became reminders that death didn't always mean silence. And so the storyteller lowers his voice, letting the firelight catch the edges of his grin. He tells you that if you ever hear something dragging across your roof at night, don't open the door. Not unless you want to see which of your neighbors couldn't bear to stay buried. The inn grows hushed again, and someone quickly changes the subject, though not to anything more cheerful. Now they say, it's time to remember the forests where legends of wolves and darker things stalked travelers who strayed from the path. The conversation tilts from the graveyard to the forest, as if the very walls of the inn can't keep out the sound of branches scratching at the imagination. You picture yourself walking beneath twisted oaks, their bark knotted like clenched fists, moonlight filtering in faint silver shafts, and the crunch of your boots too loud against the silence. The stories say the forest is alive, not just with animals but with watchers, patient and unseen. Wolves, of course, were the stars of medieval nightmares. Not the noble wolf of modern nature documentaries, but snarling red-eyed predators that lurked just beyond the torchlight. Villagers swore packs followed travelers for miles, padding silently along roads, waiting for one stumble, one dropped lantern. Wolves could scatter sheep in seconds, or worse, carry away children. But the legends went further. Some whispered of men who became wolves under the curse of sin, cursed souls condemned to prowl the night with fur and fangs. These were not fairy tales of princes hiding under spells. They were warnings told by firesides, their moral as sharp as teeth. Step outside the rules and you might lose your skin. Literally, here's a strange detail. In parts of France, suspected werewolves were actually put on trial. Yes, real trials with judges, clerks, and all the paperwork. Except the defendant was accused of shape-shifting. Records describe confessions wrung from men and women who claimed they ran through forests at night, hunting alongside beasts. Historians still debate whether these confessions were the result of torture, mental illness, or just the sheer weight of fear pressing down until imagination cracked into truth. Whatever the cause, the verdicts were often brutal. To be accused of being a werewolf was to risk fire, stake, or sword. Imagine the tension of a moonlit clearing. A shepherd disappears, his flock scattered, and the whispers start. People say they saw him slinking through the trees, his eyes glinting unnaturally. By the next full moon, torches gather at his door and he is dragged before the magistrates. A howl in the distance seals his fate. Whether wolf or man, he won't walk freely again, and yet amid the terror, some of these tales almost sound like bedtime horror comedies. Think about it. Entire villages nervously clutching garlic garlands or sharpening pitchforks, while somewhere in the shadows, a very normal wolf is probably just wondering why its dinner smells so anxious. Medieval Europe was, in a sense, the original horror film audience, gasping, clutching each other, and occasionally screaming at shadows that turned out to be rabbits. Still, you can't dismiss the edge of real danger. Forests were not theme parks. They were vast, dark, and full of sharp-toothed reality. Travelers carried not only bread but also charms, muttered prayers, and occasionally small relics to ward off creatures half believed, half imagined. Every snap of a twig could mean a wolf, a thief, or something worse. So as the storyteller's voice dips lower, you feel that tug, the invitation to glance over your shoulder, to wonder what's pacing the edges of your own lamplight, because the lesson of the Middle Ages was simple. The forest might feed you, but it might also swallow you. The fire in the inn flickers, and someone jokes nervously about howling, which earns a few uneasy laughs. But the laughter fades quickly, because another legend is pushing to the surface. One not of wolves but of the sky itself, where omens blazed and terrified whole kingdoms. The forest hushes behind you, but the sky above refuses to stay quiet. You tilt your head back, staring at the night where stars should be steady, but instead they feel like messages scribbled in fire. In the Middle Ages, the heavens weren't just a backdrop. They were a theater where doom announced itself. Comets streaked across the black like flaming swords. Eclipses swallowed the sun, and every peasant and king alike squinted upward, terrified that the universe was spelling out their obituary. Picture a cold night in 1066, when a great comet blazed across Europe. People whispered that it was a fiery spear hurled by heaven itself. Harold Godwinson, the English king, supposedly watched it with dread, and weeks later he fell at the Battle of Hastings, an arrow through the eye. The Bayeux Tapestry even stitched the comet right into its embroidery, a cosmic footnote sewn into history. It's as if the Middle Ages themselves decided, this plot twist deserves a cameo. Here's something most people don't know. Medieval scholars tried desperately to explain these lights. Some claimed comets were clouds catching fire. Others argued they were divine messengers, carrying God's wrath from one corner of the world to another. Astrologers, of course, loved the drama. Comets meant kingdoms would fall, dynasties crumble, crops wither. The sky was basically the original tabloid, splashing out terrifying headlines in streaks of white fire. Historians still debate how much these celestial events truly shaped politics, but when a ruler died suspiciously close to a comet's appearance, people didn't shrug. It became fact in their minds. Imagine being a farmer in a muddy field, pausing mid-plow as the sky burned. You don't have telescopes, you don't have physics equations. What you have are stories. The neighbor mutters it means plague, your wife swears it signals war, and the priest says it's punishment for sins you probably committed without realizing. You try to keep your head down, but that flaming arc makes every furrow feel like digging your own grave. And eclipses, oh, those were even worse. Imagine the sun vanishing in the middle of your workday, chickens roosting in confusion, and your children crying as shadows devour the world. Priests rushed to churches, bells rang wildly, and penitents whipped themselves in the streets. One chronicle claimed that during an eclipse, wolves and dogs howled as if the sky itself had become a battlefield. Historians argue whether that was exaggeration or pure panic. But the truth is clear. For a medieval villager, the end of the world always felt just one darkened sun away. You smirk now, thinking about how today we mark comet arrivals on calendars like fun tourist events. Bring your camera, it's Halley's Comet Night. Back then, no one was selling glow-in-the-dark souvenirs. They were huddled in churches, confessing everything from petty theft to skipping prayers, just in case this cosmic visitor meant their names were already written on heaven's do not enter list. The sky quiets again, stars twinkling like they never meant harm, but the damage is done. You realize the heavens were never just decoration. They were weapons, symbols, warnings, reminders that even the most powerful kings were ants under the celestial magnifying glass. And as the inn grows silent again, you notice someone at the edge of the fire stirring, preparing to tell a tale not of the skies, but of the earth itself, of castles that rose high but carried curses within their walls. The fire pops softly as you lean closer, letting the glow push back the shadows just enough for another story to creep in. Castles, those towering symbols of strength, walls of stone rising above villages like guardians. But here's the twist. In the Middle Ages, castles were just as much prisons as they were fortresses. And sometimes they were haunted not by ghosts, but by the curses whispered into their very foundations. You picture yourself standing at the base of a high wall, the stones damp and cold, ivy clawing its way upward like fingers refusing to let go. The drawbridge creaks as it lowers, and inside you hear a silence so thick it could smother you. They say one castle in Bohemia was built directly over a gateway to hell. No chapel was erected inside, no joyous halls, just walls meant to trap demons beneath. Workers claimed screams rose up through the ground, and prisoners were once lowered by rope into the pit. Most begged to be pulled up within minutes, raving about clawed hands and burning eyes. Historians still debate whether this was superstition, political theater, or just cruel entertainment, but the legend stuck. And then there's the tale of Château de Brissac in France, where a woman known as the Green Lady supposedly roams its corridors, her face split grotesquely in two, as if to remind everyone how violent betrayal can be. Her husband caught her in an affair and silenced her with a blade, but it seems death didn't muffle her sighs. Guests claimed they woke to her moans echoing in stone chambers, drifting through cold draughts that no fire could warm. Here's a fact most people overlook. Castles weren't just homes. They were stages for rumour. A lord's cruelty, a lady's sorrow, even a servant's unlucky death could ripple into myth. People needed explanations for eerie noises in draughty halls, so the tales grew. Stories of phantom knights riding down corridors, of hands scratching from within bricked-up walls. In a world where light came only from fire, every shadow felt like an audience waiting for your mistake. You chuckle softly, imagining medieval Airbnb reviews. Lovely view from the battlements, but beware the screaming pit in the courtyard. One star would not survive again. Humor aside, you know how these legends worked. They were both warning and comfort. Fear binds communities together, and a haunted castle gave people something to share when winter nights dragged too long. Some historians argue that lords even encouraged these legends, letting villagers believe demons stalked the halls because fear made power easier to maintain. If the peasants thought the walls themselves were holy shields or cursed prisons, they wouldn't question the taxes that kept those stones stacked so high. You run your hand across the imagined wall, feeling the grit of centuries and the chill that no sunlight seems able to chase away. Castles weren't just military machines, they were stories set in stone, and some of those stories were sharper than any sword. As the sparks fade upward into the night, you sense the fire is not done feeding you tales. The next one is darker still, about how fear didn't just live in walls or skies, but in the very laws people followed, laws written in blood, punishment carved into flesh. The night stretches on and the flames flicker low, casting your shadow long against the floor. You shift slightly, bracing yourself, because this next part isn't about haunted towers or cursed wells. It's about justice, or at least what people in the Middle Ages pretended was justice. Trial by ordeal, they called it. Sounds official, right? But really it was the medieval version of let's see if God likes you today. Picture this. You're accused of theft, witchcraft, or some other crime no one can really prove. Instead of a jury, you're handed a glowing iron bar and told to walk 3 steps while carrying it. Then your hand is wrapped in cloth for 3 days. If it heals clean, you're innocent. If it festers, well, guess you were guilty all along. It's like going to the emergency room today, except your diagnosis depends on divine Wi-Fi signal strength. One infamous ordeal involved water. You'd be tied up and tossed into a river. The theory was simple. Water, being pure, would reject the guilty. So if you floated, you were in league with the devil. If you sank, congratulations, you were innocent, though unfortunately also drowned. Historians still debate whether these trials were believed to be genuine divine judgment, or whether they were really just elaborate theatre, designed to scare communities into obedience. And here's a little-known twist. Some ordeals weren't meant to kill at all. The boiling water test, for example, sometimes used warm water rather than scalding. The idea wasn't always to destroy the accused, it was to frighten the crowd into compliance. You see, ordeals were as much about spectacle as they were about guilt. A trembling villager, a priest chanting, a crowd holding its breath. It was drama worthy of a Netflix series, minus the binge-watching comfort. You imagine yourself standing, their wrists trembling as the priest holds out the iron. The villagers lean forward, some hoping you fail, others whispering prayers. Your life hangs not on truth but on the appearance of it, and as smoke rises from the glowing metal, you can almost hear the unspoken rules. Survive this, and you might. Live, fail, and you'll become another warning told by firelight. Here's the irony. Sometimes the accused survived perfectly fine, and that survival turned into a kind of power. If you carried the hot iron without blistering, people didn't just see you as innocent. They whispered that God must have truly favored you. In a world drowning in superstition, that could make you untouchable. But most weren't so lucky, and for women, ordeals were particularly cruel. Accused of gossiping too much, being too independent, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, they faced these divine judgments as if their lives were nothing more than dice rolls in heaven's casino. Some historians even argue that these trials functioned less as justice and more as crowd control. Rituals that reinforced the hierarchy, reminding everyone of their place under God and King. You let the thought linger, the fire crackling like laughter from the shadows. Justice in those days wasn't blind. It was blindfolded, spinning in circles, throwing darts in the dark. And every dart carried blood on its tip. The night leans closer, and you sense the story isn't done. There's another layer to uncover. One not about ordeals, but about fear made permanent. Fear etched into laws, punishments, and the daily rhythm of life, where even the smallest mistakes carried terrifying legends of their own. The candlelight wavers, and your mind drifts toward the darker edge of medieval superstition, where law met terror, and the gallows stood like grim punctuation marks at the end of village life. Executions weren't just punishments, they were performances. You didn't need Netflix, TikTok, or cable back then. You had the scaffold in the town square, complete with screaming vendors, gossiping neighbors, and the smell of roasted chestnuts mixing with smoke and fear. Imagine the wooden platform creaking under the weight of justice, or what passed for justice. A thief might lose a hand, a heretic might burn, a noble might at least be afforded the courtesy of a cleaner beheading. For women, though, things often spiraled into spectacle. Accused of witchcraft? Up you go in flames. Caught poisoning a husband? Buried alive in some regions. Even the whispers of immorality could lead to a punishment designed not just to kill but to humiliate. Public shame was a weapon sharpened as cruelly as any blade. And here's the twist historians still puzzle over. Executions were often scheduled like theater events. Market days, feast days, or saints' festivals were prime times, because more people meant a bigger audience. It was less about the condemned and more about the message. Picture the medieval version of a movie trailer. Coming this Saturday, one poor soul meets the fire, don't miss it. Darkly amusing, until you realize it was someone's mother, son, or neighbor. One legend tells of a condemned knight who cracked jokes all the way to the gallows, mocking the crowd until the rope silenced him. Some said his humor was bravery, others whispered it was madness. Historians debate whether tales like his were embellished, moral lessons dressed up as entertainment. Either way, the story stuck, because gallows humor, quite literally, was the only resistance left. You can almost feel yourself standing in that crowd, pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with anticipation. Children on tiptoe, merchants hawking bread, a priest raising his hand for silence. The condemned looks out over the sea of faces, searching for sympathy but finding only curiosity. It's not justice, it's community theater with blood for props. And yet executions weren't only about death. They were also about memory. People remembered the smell of burning, the shape of the gallows, the sound of a final scream. Those memories hung in the air, deterrence more lasting than any law written on parchment. That's the terrifying part. The punishment wasn't just for the criminal, it was for everyone watching. A reminder of the invisible cage holding them all in place. As the smoke curls into the starless sky of your imagination, you can't help but shiver. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't a scale. It was a hammer, and it fell hard, sometimes on the guilty, sometimes on the unlucky, sometimes simply on the inconvenient. And the legend of those hammers still echoes, doesn't it? You feel the weight in your chest, a whisper of fear, a reminder that history doesn't always stay buried. It lingers in the stories we tell before bed, hoping to turn fear into understanding. The smoke clears, but the fear lingers. You can almost still smell it, drifting like an aftertaste in your mind, when another kind of terror creeps closer, the kind that doesn't wait for courts or gallows, but rises from the ground itself. The Middle Ages were thick with stories of the restless dead, and people whispered about corpses that didn't stay where they were put. Forget vampires in capes or zombies in movies. These were revenants, dead neighbors who got up at night to knock on doors, spread disease, or just scare the life out of the living. Picture it. A quiet village at dusk, smoke curling from chimneys, animals settling down for the night. Then someone swears they hear heavy footsteps outside their door, dragging uneven, like boots filled with mud. A knock 3 times. If you opened it, there was nothing there. But by morning, someone in the house would be sick or even dead. That's how the legend went. Revenants didn't just walk, they brought calamity. Medieval horror films, only without the popcorn. And here's the chilling twist. Historians still debate whether these stories were just superstition, or if they were the medieval way of explaining outbreaks of plague and sudden illness. Imagine not understanding germs, but seeing patterns of sickness spread after funerals. It wasn't bacteria to them. It was Uncle Gerard crawling out of his grave to cough on everyone. Makes hand sanitizer look like the invention of the century, doesn't it? The remedies were creative, to say the least. In some regions, villagers dug up suspected revenants, chopped off their heads or pinned them to the ground with iron stakes. In others, they stuffed the corpse's mouth with stones so it couldn't call out names of its next victims. Imagine being the poor gravedigger told, "Oh, by the way, could you open Aunt Margaret's coffin and make sure she's not about to ruin the harvest?" That's a job listing nobody's swiping right on. One legend tells of a man in northern England who was so feared after death that the villagers exhumed him and burned his body, then scattered the ashes into a river. Some versions say his ghost still walked, glowing faintly, until a priest finally performed an exorcism. Historians argue whether the tale reflects real events or symbolic warnings about sin. But the detail of glowing ashes sticks with you. It's like something out of a medieval graphic novel. You walk with the villagers in your imagination, lanterns flickering, shovels in hand, fear thick as fog. They gather at the churchyard muttering prayers, faces pale under the moon. The ground is turned, the coffin lifted, and suddenly the line between superstition and desperation blurs. Are they saving themselves from evil, or simply wrestling with grief in the only way they know how? And you realize the scariest part isn't the thought of corpses wandering. It's the thought of being trapped in a world where you can't explain sickness, death, or loss. So you make stories, legends, monsters. You wrap the unknown in fear because it's easier to fight something with a name. Even if it's undead, Uncle Gerard. You let the image fade, the lanterns dimming, the villagers trudging home, their fear momentarily soothed, but you know the whispers will start again with the next cough, the next fever, the next funeral bell. That's the cycle of legends. They never really die. The whispers of revenants still echo in your mind, but soon they are drowned out by something darker, heavier, unstoppable. It isn't a single wandering corpse this time. It's an entire wave of death that sweeps across continents. The Black Death. Just saying the name feels heavy like an anchor in your chest. You can almost smell it. A sickly sweet rot drifting through narrow streets, lingering in the wool of cloaks, hiding in the rafters of homes. Imagine walking through your village and seeing shutters nailed shut, doors marked with crude crosses smeared in red. Silence hangs in the air, broken only by the cries of the sick or the carts rattling past, piled with bodies under rough cloth. You'd avoid the sound of wheels on cobblestone, the way we avoid the ringtone of a telemarketer today. Every creak meant loss. Theories swirled about what caused it. Some thought it was punishment from God, sin boiling over into plague. Others blamed bad air, miasma, seeping from swamps or carried on foul winds. A few, with suspicious precision, blamed cats. Yes, cats, which would have been hilarious if it hadn't led to massacres of felines, ironically worsening the spread of rats and fleas. The medieval version of, let's fix the problem by making it 10 times worse. And then there were the more sinister scapegoats. Rumors accused outsiders, strangers, or specific communities of poisoning wells. Entire villages turned into mobs, punishing the innocent in their desperation to find someone, anyone to blame. Historians still debate how much of this was hysteria, how much was exploitation of fear by those in power. But either way, the plague didn't care about politics. It just kept moving. You picture the plague doctors, those eerie figures in long coats, gloves and bird-like masks, stuffed with herbs and flowers. People thought the mask would filter the deadly air, as though lavender could stop what we now know was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium hitchhiking on fleas. To a modern eye, the costume looks like a Halloween outfit, designed by someone who hates kids. But to the terrified villagers, it was a fragile hope, proof that someone was trying to fight the invisible. The numbers are staggering. 1/3 of Europe's population gone in just a few years. Imagine losing every third person you know. Friends, neighbors, entire families erased. Cemeteries overflowed, so they dug trenches, tossing bodies in by the hundreds. The sight must have been unbearable, and yet it became the new normal. Survival meant learning not to flinch, and amid all that death, strange beliefs sprouted. Some thought flagellation, whipping themselves bloody in the streets, might earn God's mercy. Others clung to charms, amulets, whispered prayers to saints. One story tells of a village where people carried bouquets everywhere, not for beauty, but to mask the stench of decay. "Ring around the rosy," the children sang centuries later, maybe echoing that memory. though historians still debate whether the nursery rhyme really links back to the plague. As you imagine all this, the fear seeps into you thick and oppressive. So it's not just the disease, it's the helplessness. No cure, no explanation, no control. And you realize the true terror of the Black Death wasn't the fever or the swellings. It was the silence between coughs, the waiting, the knowing tomorrow might never come. You let your breath slow, picturing the streets at dusk, lanterns flickering in empty windows, the world muted. Legends grew in that silence because people needed stories to hold back the dark. Revenants, curses, divine punishment, it all made sense when nothing else did. And even now, centuries later, the echo of that dread hasn't fully faded. The shadow of plague hasn't even left your bones when another dread creeps in. Not sickness this time, but human cruelty dressed as justice. Torture in the Middle Ages wasn't just punishment. It was performance legend-making through pain. You can almost hear the scrape of iron on stone, the clink of chains echoing through damp chambers. It's the sound of fear turned into spectacle. Picture yourself dragged into a vaulted room beneath a castle, torchlight flickering across walls wet with condensation. The Inquisitor stands waiting, robes stiff, eyes cold, reciting charges in a monotone that sounds almost bored. You barely catch your breath before you see the instruments. Racks, iron boots, thumbscrews, each one designed not simply to hurt, but to extract something, confession, compliance, or just a reminder of who holds power. It's like a twisted medieval version of customer service. You're going to give them what they want, whether you mean it or not. The rack stretches your body until your joints snap like twigs. The iron boot squeezes your feet until bones splinter, sometimes packed with wedges hammered in tighter with each blow. There's a grotesque practicality to it. Destroy the body to reveal the truth. Historians still debate how often these methods were actually used versus how much they were exaggerated in stories to scare people into obedience. But even if you never saw a rack in your lifetime, the mere rumor of it was enough to keep you quiet. And then there's the infamous scold's bridle, an iron cage fitted over a woman's head, with a spiked bit pressed into her tongue to silence nagging or gossip. Imagine standing in the marketplace with that contraption biting your mouth while villagers jeered. It wasn't just pain. It was humiliation, a legend written on living flesh. Execution itself was another theater altogether. Beheadings with blunt axes, hangings that sometimes failed, and burnings at the stake that turned into community events. Parents would bring children, as though watching someone charred alive was a family outing. And if that doesn't feel chilling enough, consider this. Some people weren't even executed for crimes but for spectacle. Their suffering turned into a moral lesson written in screams. Not all torture was physical. The medieval imagination thrived on psychological cruelty. Some prisoners were left in darkness for weeks, their food shoved through cracks, their sense of time erased. Others were shown their instruments of torture first, the silence dragging out until fear alone did the work. You realize here that the body isn't the only battlefield. The mind was fair game too. And here's the strange twist. While these methods loom large in legend, many legal scholars argue that medieval justice wasn't all sadism. Village courts often preferred fines, shaming rituals, or exile. The torture chambers were the domain of inquisitions and state power, not everyday life. But that doesn't erase the fact that the stories spread, exaggerated or not, and those stories did their job. You didn't need to see the rack. You only needed to believe it was waiting. So you lie back in your imagination, hearing the clank of chains, the whispered prayers of those dragged before authority, the smell of smoke rising from stakes in the square. The most terrifying legends of the Middle Ages weren't only about monsters in the woods. They were about what men did to each other in broad daylight, under the banner of righteousness. The chamber doors of torture close in your mind, but the echo lingers and suddenly you're somewhere else, somewhere colder. Imagine walking through a vast stone corridor, your steps muffled by ancient dust. Castles in the Middle Ages weren't just fortresses. They became vessels for stories that refused to die. And of course, those stories usually came at night, when the torches guttered low and the wind whispered through arrow slits like a choir of ghosts. Take Hauska Castle in Bohemia. Built, legend says, not to protect people from enemies outside, but to seal a pit that was believed to be a literal gateway to hell. Locals swore they saw winged creatures crawl out of it at night, half man, half bat, flapping against the stone walls before vanishing into the woods. Soldiers sent to guard the pit supposedly refused, trembling more at shadows than any invading army. Historians still debate whether Hauska was truly a fortress against demons or just another stronghold with a good marketing strategy, but the whispers stuck. Or consider Chillingham Castle in England, where the so-called Blue Boy was said to cry out in the dead of night. For centuries, guests reported waking to see a flash of blue light hovering near the walls, followed by the wail of a child. Later renovations revealed the skeleton of a boy and scraps of blue cloth sealed inside the castle walls. Creepy, absolutely. Coincidence? Maybe. But the story persists because it tickles that primal fear, that stone walls don't just hold history, they hold the echoes of the forgotten. You wander through these corridors, hearing your own breath, and imagine knights clanking down the stairs, only to vanish before your eyes. Some castles were said to have spectral guards still marching their eternal rounds, refusing to abandon posts centuries after death. It's like the world's most dedicated security staff, except instead of flashlights, they've got glowing eyes and a bone-rattling chill. And let's not forget the women of the castles, often tied to stories of tragic love or betrayal. The White Lady appears across Europe, a pale figure drifting through towers, mourning lost children or lost freedoms. Historians argue that these repeating legends might have been narrative recycling, one tragic ghost story copy-pasted into different castles to entertain weary travelers. But you can't shake the image of a veiled woman gliding past your torch, silent except for the sound of her gown brushing against cold stone. Here's the twist. Castles weren't just seats of power, they were prisons of memory. Every execution in the courtyard, every whispered prayer in the chapel, every scream in the dungeons left behind an atmosphere you can almost breathe. Maybe it's not ghosts at all. Maybe it's history itself replaying on an endless loop, waiting for someone like you to stumble into the dark and listen. So you keep walking through this midnight fortress, every step taking you deeper into the stories that cling to stone. The torch in your hand flickers, and for just a moment you think you see something move at the far end of the hall. The torch sputters in that long castle hall, and when it fades you find yourself stepping into another darkness entirely, the kind that doesn't haunt walls, but whole continents. The Black Death, rolling through Europe in the mid-14th century, was less a plague than an apocalypse. You imagine the streets of a medieval town, the air thick with the stench of sickness, carts piled high with bodies, bells tolling until the sound itself felt diseased. People whispered of omens, comets blazing across the night sky, strange animals born with two heads, even clouds shaped like swords. Every shadow felt like a prophecy. The truth was grimmer than any omen. Fleas and rats did the spreading, though nobody knew it at the time. Instead, blame fell on everything from bad air to foreign travelers to, you guessed it, witches and women with suspicious herbs. You'd be amazed how fast paranoia can sprint when death is on its heels. And here's the cruelest irony. Some towns thought ringing church bells would drive away the plague, but in reality, it just meant more hands touching the same ropes, spreading disease faster. Historians still debate whether the death toll was closer to 1/3 or 1/2 of Europe's population. But either way, it's a statistic so crushing it feels more like myth than fact. And speaking of myth, stories flourished like mold on damp bread. The plague doctor with his bird-beak mask, striding through alleys like some nightmare stalk, became an icon. The mask wasn't just for show. It was stuffed with herbs meant to purify the air. So unfortunately, it didn't work. But the image stuck, becoming a symbol of dread that still gives you goosebumps. Imagine waking at night and seeing one of those silhouettes outside your window, lamp glowing faintly through the fog. That's not just history. It's a horror movie on legs. Then there were the so-called plague saints. Some believed that holy relics could ward off the disease. Pilgrims flocked to touch bones of martyrs, scraps of cloth, even rusty chains said to have bound apostles. Desperation makes people creative, though not always logical. And when that failed, processions of flagellants whipped themselves bloody in the streets, convinced their suffering might convince God to ease up on humanity. From today's perspective, it feels like watching someone try to fix a broken smartphone by yelling at it. But back then, it was raw survival instinct dressed in ritual. Yet there was one detail that never quite made it into the popular retellings: the eerie quiet after the storm. Entire villages abandoned, fields overgrown, houses left with meals still half prepared on the table. Walking through them, you'd think people had simply evaporated. Some towns were never re-inhabited, left to crumble into ghost settlements. Archaeologists still stumble across them, silent reminders that death didn't just take people. It erased communities wholesale. You feel the weight of it pressing against your chest, the idea that breath itself was once the enemy, that survival felt less like triumph and more like borrowed time. And yet humans kept going, rebuilding, reshaping. And yes, telling stories to make sense of the chaos. Your steps carry you away from plague carts and silence, into the next shadow of medieval terror. The fear of witches rising, accusations thickening in the smoky air, until even the simplest herb garden looked like a coven. The smoke clears from the plague pits, but in its place rises a different kind of haze, one woven of suspicion, gossip, and firelight. You walk through a village at dusk, and every shadow seems sharper. Every whispered conversation feels like it's about you. The Middle Ages didn't invent witchcraft accusations, but they sharpened them into a blade. One cough, one spoiled batch of butter, one unlucky glance, and suddenly the word witch slips from someone's lips like poison. Picture it, a woman, maybe widowed, maybe just a little too outspoken, standing before the village magistrates. Her herb basket is at her feet, filled with sage, fennel, and rue, ordinary remedies, but now painted as sinister. The crowd shifts uneasily, waiting for her to stumble in her prayers or flinch at the sight of a cross. The cruel trick is that no reaction is safe. Too calm? Clearly the devil steadies her. Too anxious? Clearly she hides guilt. Historians still debate whether most people genuinely believed in witches, or whether accusations were a convenient way to punish women who stepped outside the lines. Either way, belief or not, the stakes were terrifyingly real. Here's a chilling detail. Witch tests were often designed so that survival itself looked like guilt. Dunking a woman in water, if she floated, she was a witch. If she sank, she was innocent, though drowning didn't leave much room to celebrate. Or the witch's mark. A mole, a scar, even a freckle could be declared the devil's seal. Imagine living in a world where your skin was essentially a crime scene waiting to be interpreted. And it wasn't just trials. It was the whispers before them that cut the deepest. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid you. Children hurled insults. Merchants refused to sell you bread. Even without a pyre or a rope, isolation itself became a punishment, the kind that gnawed slowly at your spirit. In a society where community was survival, being cast out was as deadly as fire. Yet not all witches were feared. Some were secretly sought after. A whispered charm to bring back a straying husband. A salve for aching joints. A spell for good harvest. People wanted the power they pretended to despise. It's the medieval version of clearing your browser history. You don't want anyone to know you looked, but you definitely went searching. The irony is almost too rich. The same villagers who condemned a woman by day might be knocking on her door by night, begging for remedies. You walk away from the scene with unease crawling under your skin. The word witch lingers in the air, dangerous as sparks near dry straw. It's a reminder that sometimes the deadliest weapons aren't swords or arrows. They're words whispered at the wrong moment. Ahead the path darkens, not with rumor, but with fire itself. The Inquisition waits cloaked in authority, where suspicion becomes system and faith sharpens into terror. You hear boots on cobblestones, the scrape of wooden benches dragged across stone floors, and suddenly the whispers of witchcraft feel almost quaint compared to what comes next. The Inquisition arrives not as a rumor, but as a system, an institution with its own machinery of fear. Imagine men in robes, parchment clutched in their hands, eyes sharp not with curiosity but with certainty. They're not here to ask questions. They're here to find answers they've already decided upon. You sit in a dim chamber lit only by torches, smoke curling up toward a vaulted ceiling. The Inquisitor's voice booms as he reads a list of charges: heresy, blasphemy, consorting with the devil. The words are so broad, so slippery, that anyone could fit into them if the mood demanded it. Did you skip Mass? Did you mutter complaints about taxes? Did you tell a friend that perhaps the priest was wrong? Congratulations, you've just written your own confession whether you meant to or not. Historians still argue whether the Inquisition's main purpose was genuine religious zeal or a more political game, a way to consolidate power, silence dissent, and keep communities obedient under a banner of fear. Here's the terrifying detail. Confession wasn't always voluntary. Torture chambers stood ready, stocked with devices that sound like the rejected props of a horror movie. The rack stretched limbs until joints popped. The strappado dangled victims by their wrists until shoulders dislocated. The inquisitors justified it all with a neat little loophole. Torture didn't count as punishment. It was merely persuasion. You have to admire, in a dark way, how medieval lawyers could twist words sharper than any blade, and yet, even without iron or rope, the psychological weight was crushing. People confessed to things they'd never done just to end the ordeal. Entire communities learned to self-censor, to police their neighbors, to bow lower and whisper softer. It's like living in a never-ending performance review. Except the HR department has a torch and a pair of manacles. But here's the strange, almost absurd irony. While the Inquisition roared loudly in sermons and trials, daily life for most peasants still turned on ploughing fields and mending roofs. For many, the shadow of heresy was distant until suddenly it wasn't, until the men in robes came to your town, and your village square turned into a stage of accusations. Fear was selective, unpredictable, which made it all the more effective. You imagine stepping out of the tribunal into the cool night air, your body intact, but your spirit heavy. Behind you, the bells toll and another name is etched into the record of guilt. Ahead, the road winds back to your home, where you'll lay down, knowing the walls themselves seem to listen. The Inquisition wasn't just about burning bodies. It was about burning the idea that you were ever safe. The clang of steel drifts across your imagination, and with it comes the image we've all been sold. A knight in gleaming armor, visor down, sword raised high, the very picture of noble protection. You almost want to hum the theme from a blockbuster movie trailer. But as you follow this knight through the muddy lanes of the Middle Ages, the sheen begins to tarnish. Chivalry, it turns out, wasn't always the bedtime story you've been told. It was often a marketing campaign for men with lances. You see him ride past, his horse draped in saffron-colored cloth stitched with his family crest. Children point in awe, women bow their heads. The knight is supposed to embody honor, loyalty, and devotion to God. But beneath the polished plates, his world is messy. He's bound by codes that sound noble. Protect the weak, defend the church, honor women. But the fine print is something else. Protect the weak, unless raiding their village enriches your lord. Defend the church, unless the Pope himself is feuding with your king. Honor women, unless they belong to the enemy. In which case, well, history gets uncomfortably quiet. Historians still argue whether chivalry was a real ethical system or more of a PR strategy. On the one hand, you had epic poems like The Song of Roland and Arthurian legends, turning knights into the medieval avengers. On the other hand, you had peasants' chronicles quietly noting that knights often left fields trampled, granaries empty, and villages smoking. Some knights were closer to highway robbers with better armor and a slightly improved dental plan. And then there were the tournaments, supposedly a civilized way to practice warfare, but more like a medieval reality show. Picture a crowd cheering while men in indigo and russet tilt at each other with lances, and somewhere in the stands a noblewoman tosses a token, maybe a scarf. Sounds romantic, right? Except these contests often ended in crushed ribs, broken necks, and bankrupt families who wagered too heavily on their champion. If ESPN had existed back then, it would have needed a parental advisory warning. Here's the fun contradiction. While knights swore to serve ladies with devotion, the very same code treated women as prizes, inspiration props rather than people. Your virtue might be sung in a troubadour's ballad one day, and ignored the next when armies marched across your land. Chivalry could elevate women into muses or saints, but it just as easily erased them into footnotes. You walk past the lists where two knights square off, their shields clanging like frying pans. The crowd roars, banners flap, dust rises. For a moment you feel swept up in the glamour, but then you notice the peasants pressed against the outer fence, their eyes calculating what damage today's show will bring tomorrow. Horses need feeding, debts need paying, and all that shining steel doesn't come cheap. As the knight rides off into the sunset, or more likely into another skirmish, you realize the legend of chivalry isn't about perfect heroes. It's about how stories smooth over dents in armor until only the shine remains. And those stories stick, lingering like bedtime tales meant to comfort rather than reflect truth. The battlefield opens before you, and the air is thick with a metallic tang that seeps into your nostrils. You almost want to plug your nose like you're walking past an overflowing dumpster in July, but there's no escape here. The clash of armies in the Middle Ages was not the clean chessboard of knights moving with noble precision. It was chaos, mud and blood, with fear rising like smoke from the ground. You picture the armies assembling, banners snapping in the wind, colors of indigo and saffron fluttering against the grey sky. To one side, a row of armored men-at-arms lowering their lances. To the other, ragged foot soldiers gripping spears they can barely lift. The noise builds before the fighting even starts. Horns blaring, drums pounding, men muttering prayers under their breath. If you've ever heard the start of a rock concert, only replace guitars with screams, you've got the right idea. When the two sides finally crash together, the world narrows into steel on steel, a blur of shield edges, sword swings, and horses trampling over anyone unlucky enough to stumble. Your ears ring with the impact, and you realize quickly the glory was mostly for the poets. In reality, medieval battlefields were closer to horror shows than epics. Wounds festered quickly without antiseptics. Arrows punched through flesh with sickening force, and the mud beneath your feet turned into a slick mixture you really don't want to think about. Here's a less glamorous truth. Battles often didn't last long. Sometimes after just a few brutal charges, one side would break, the field littered with abandoned shields and bodies. And the rules of war? Flexible at best. Knights might ransom each other for profit, but peasants and foot soldiers were rarely so lucky. They were slaughtered or left to rot. Historians still debate how often the codes of conduct were followed, but the evidence suggests it depended more on convenience than on principle. You spot the archers in the back, drawing longbows with terrifying efficiency. Their arrows darken the sky before falling like rain, and you imagine what it felt like to stand beneath that storm. The English longbow at Agincourt, for example, could pierce armor, turning even a proud knight into a pincushion. Modern video games would probably call it overpowered. And then there's the aftermath, which most legends politely skip over. The groaning of the wounded carries on long after the clash has ended. Battlefield surgeons, if you can call them that, arrive with knives heated in fire, their medicine often worse than the wound itself. You don't hear ballads about the smell of burning flesh when cauterization was the only option, or about how a soldier might bite down on a strap of leather, praying he wouldn't pass out. Standing there, you realize the so-called honor of war was mostly written by survivors trying to give meaning to trauma. For those in the mud, war wasn't about banners or glory. It was about surviving the next 5 minutes. And for those left behind, especially women and children, the battle often arrived at their doors in the form of pillaging and terror. The bells roll heavy across the air, as if each strike is hammering straight into your chest. You follow their sound through narrow streets until you reach a procession, hooded figures moving slowly, carrying candles that sputter in the wind. Death in the Middle Ages wasn't a private affair. It was a community performance, a ritual where grief mixed with fear, and superstition clung to every step. You see the bier carried at the front, a body wrapped in linen, face pale, hands folded stiffly across the chest. Around it, villagers shuffle, whispering prayers half out of respect and half out of dread. Because here's the unsettling truth. Death was never just about the end of a life. It was about where the soul might go next. And the medieval imagination could be terrifyingly vivid about that. Legends whispered that if proper rites weren't performed, the dead might rise again. Not like Hollywood zombies. Think more along the lines of restless spirits, revenants who creaked back into villages, pale and bloated, demanding food or tormenting their kin. Chroniclers in England and France recorded stories of corpses scratching at doors, or neighbors claiming they saw the dead walking fields at night. Historians still debate whether these tales were symbolic metaphors for grief or genuine panic written into parish records. Either way, the fear was real. You imagine yourself clutching a candle in that procession, wondering if the body on the bier might stir. It sounds absurd now, like something out of a horror podcast, but to medieval villagers, the line between natural and supernatural was razor thin. A sudden illness, a shadow at dusk. Even the way a corpse decomposed too slowly could fuel whispers that someone hadn't stayed in their grave. Priests, of course, played their part, chanting Latin over the coffin, sprinkling holy water, and reminding everyone that sin clung like burrs. If the deceased hadn't confessed properly, If they'd been excommunicated or, God forbid, accused of witchcraft, their burial might be denied in consecrated ground. Imagine the grief of a mother being told her child, born still and unbaptized, couldn't rest in hallowed earth. That kind of sorrow sticks like a thorn in the heart. And then came the rituals of protection. People laid iron scissors across corpses, tied their jaws shut, or buried them with stones in their mouths to stop them from rising. Some even hammered stakes through the chest, or pinned bodies with heavy rocks, a practice that eerily foreshadows vampire legends centuries later. This wasn't Gothic fiction. This was Tuesday in a village terrified of the dark. But here's the irony. Death was also spectacle. Funeral processions could be grand affairs for nobles, with banners, musicians, even hired mourners weeping dramatically. It was part grief, part theatre, and maybe part flex. Because what better way to show off your wealth than by making sure your death was louder than your life? You linger near the graveyard gates as the bells fade. The candles gutter out and the darkness settles in. Somewhere nearby, a dog howls long and low, and villagers glance nervously at the fresh mound of earth. You realize that for medieval people, the end was never neat. The dead might rest or they might return. The monastery looms in your imagination, its stone walls blotting out the stars. You step into the cloister, where the air is damp and heavy, the kind of chill that seeps through wool and bone alike. It should feel safe here, holy even, but instead, every corner seems to hum with unease, as though centuries of whispered prayers have left shadows behind. You watch the monks move silently, their habits swaying as they file into the chapel. Their chants rise low and steady, meant to keep the darkness at bay. But here's the twist. Sometimes it wasn't the outside world that frightened them most. It was what they believed stirred within the very walls of their sacred spaces. Monastic chronicles are full of accounts of demons prowling at night, scratching at doors, or appearing in visions so vivid they blurred the line between dream and reality. Imagine being a weary monk, kneeling in prayer, when suddenly your candle guttered out and a voice whispered your name in a tongue you didn't know. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the echo of your own thoughts. Or maybe it was something else. Historians still debate whether these tales were genuine encounters, psychological strain from endless fasting and isolation, or carefully crafted warnings meant to keep novices obedient. You picture a young novice alone in his cell, clutching a wooden cross while shadows slither across the walls. His mind recites psalms, but his heart pounds with terror. To him, the devil wasn't metaphorical. The devil was a tangible presence, ready to pounce the moment his faith faltered. And if he confessed to such visions, it wasn't treated as imagination. It was proof of a spiritual battle. Then there are the saints, those exceptions who claimed visions of Christ, angels or terrifying apocalyptic scenes. Think of Hildegard of Bingen, sketching strange mandala-like patterns of light and fire, or Catherine of Siena, describing demons clawing at her as she prayed. Some visions were embraced as divine, others condemned as delusion or heresy. The Church's stamp of approval, or disapproval, decided whether you were holy or insane. A fine line, as fragile as parchment. And here's a curious detail. Monasteries often kept relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, even drops of blood in crystal vials. These relics were believed to protect the community from evil. Yet, ironically, the holier the relic, the more terrifying the legends surrounding it. People whispered that demons tried to snatch relics, or that relics glowed or bled in warning. You can almost see a monk waking at night to find the reliquary trembling faintly in the moonlight. The cloister at midnight was its own theatre of fear. The silence pressed in, broken only by the rustle of robes or the distant hoot of an owl. And if one monk whispered that he saw a horned figure standing by the altar, soon the entire community might believe it. Fear was contagious, spreading faster than any plague. Yet despite the terror, monasteries endured. The monks kept chanting, kept copying manuscripts, kept tending gardens as if the devil himself weren't lurking at their doors. Maybe that resilience is the most chilling part. Not the visions, but the fact that they learned to live with them, as if demons were just another nuisance like rats or cold drafts. You leave behind the cloister's echoing chants, only to find yourself wandering into a countryside where the soil itself seems cursed. Picture this: a rolling meadow under moonlight, quiet and still, yet the villagers whisper that no one dares to plough here. They call it the Devil's Field. Why? Because strange things happen. Tools break, animals refuse to graze, and crops wither as though scorched by invisible fire. It's not exactly the type of real estate anyone is fighting over. You walk across the uneven ground, your boots crunching against stones that seem too black, too slick, almost like glass. Legends say these stones fell from the sky during storms, hurled by demons in a celestial battle. Others claim witches danced here at night, leaving behind patches of barren earth as footprints of their Sabbath. It's the medieval version of, don't build your house here or the Wi-Fi will never work. But here's the unsettling part. Many of these cursed lands actually line up with real geological quirks. Marshes where poisonous gas rises, rocky hills where lightning strikes again and again, or patches of soil drained of nutrients by natural causes. To medieval villagers, this wasn't science. It was proof that the devil had claimed the land. Historians still debate how much was genuine superstition and how much was an attempt to explain the unexplainable. Imagine the fear of living beside such a field. Every time your child coughed, you'd glance toward it. Every failed harvest felt like its curse spreading, and sometimes the church stepped in, declaring such land unsuitable, reinforcing the belief with processions, holy water, and the occasional dramatic exorcism of the earth itself. Then there were lakes and rivers whispered to be haunted. Villagers swore they saw glowing shapes beneath the water, souls trapped perhaps, or demons waiting to drag the unwary below. People avoided fishing at night, convinced that certain waters belonged to darker powers. And if someone drowned, that was no accident. It was the water taking what it was owed. A curious story drifts from Eastern Europe about a place where no birds sang. The silence itself was treated as proof of evil. Travelers reported unease, feeling watched even in broad daylight. Scientists today might shrug and say the area had fewer nesting species, but to a medieval villager, the absence of birdsong was like a neon sign flashing. The devil lives here. You imagine villagers gathering at the edge of such a field, torches in hand, muttering prayers. No one dares step inside, except perhaps a daring youth on a dare, or a desperate peasant hoping the soil might by some miracle grow enough grain to survive winter. If they returned unharmed, the story grew larger. If they didn't, well, the legend gained another verse. As you move away, you realize these cursed lands weren't just scary stories. They shaped how people built their lives, where they farmed, and how they explained tragedy. And you can feel it in your bones, the sense that even the ground under your feet might not be trustworthy. You step away from the barren field, only to realize that danger doesn't always spread across landscapes. It can also lurk in the smallest of objects. In the Middle Ages, people whispered about cursed relics, enchanted jewelry, and weapons that brought ruin to anyone foolish enough to wield them. Imagine buying a used sword at the medieval flea market, only to find out it comes with a free side of lifelong misfortune. The most infamous of these were relics, supposedly holy objects tied to saints. Many were genuine expressions of faith, pieces of bone, splinters of wood, drops of blood. But others carried darker reputations. Villagers claimed certain relics were tainted, cursed by false miracles or stolen from unholy ground. If a relic failed to protect a village from famine or plague, whispers spread that it was never holy at all, but a trap from the devil. Imagine donating your life savings for a holy nail only to discover it's just a rusty horseshoe. That's medieval buyer's remorse. Then there were rings and charms said to curse their owners. One story tells of a silver ring that promised love, but brought only sudden deaths among those who wore it. A tale from France spoke of a carved ivory comb that made its users lose their hair. A medieval nightmare in a world where your braid was basically your reputation. These legends spread quickly, and soon any item associated with tragedy was avoided, even if the tragedy was coincidence. Historians still debate whether these were warnings against greed and vanity, or if people truly believed that evil could cling to material things. Weapons carried their own dread. Knights told of swords that turned against their masters, spears that never missed but always demanded blood. A famous tale from Germany describes a dagger found on a battlefield, its handle engraved with symbols no one understood. Each new owner died mysteriously, falling from a horse, drowning in a shallow stream, struck by sudden fever. The dagger vanished eventually, but the story lingered like a ghost in the collective memory. Even household objects could carry suspicion. A cracked mirror was thought to trap the soul, while a spilled salt cellar hinted at brewing misfortune. A family might burn a wooden spoon if they believed it had stirred too many unlucky pots. In a world where survival hinged on fragile balances, it made sense. If something bad happened, you wanted a culprit. Sometimes that culprit was a thing. Picture yourself sitting in a dim cottage, clutching a charm meant to ward off sickness. You don't know if it works, but you know what people will say if your child dies despite it. The charm was cursed. And once that idea takes root, it doesn't matter if you bury it, burn it, or throw it in the river. The fear clings tighter than smoke. As you pass through these stories, you realize cursed objects weren't just about fear. They were a way of giving shape to tragedy, of making loss feel less random. After all, it's easier to blame a ring, a sword, or a relic than to face the brutal truth of chance. You walk onward, and the air seems heavier, as though carrying the weight of centuries-old whispers. Cursed families. Now there's a thought chilling enough to keep even the bravest knight awake at night. Not just one unlucky person, but entire bloodlines, shadowed by doom that clung to them like ivy on a crumbling castle wall. Imagine being born and realizing your family crest might as well be a skull and crossbones. The tales echo through Europe. In Normandy there was talk of a noble line, whose sons never survived beyond their 30th year. Each generation tried everything, pilgrimages, relics, even marrying into luckier families, but still the curse struck. You can picture the anxiety of a young heir blowing out candles on his 29th birthday, wondering if he should even bother baking the cake. Historians still debate whether these deaths were coincidence, hereditary illness, or embellished legends. But to medieval villagers there was no doubt the family carried a curse. One of the most famous examples comes from England, the so-called Curse of the Plantagenets. Whispers said that Henry II's descendants were doomed to endless strife because of the murder of Thomas Becket, the archbishop slain in Canterbury Cathedral. And lo and behold, generations of bloody feuds, rebellions, and betrayals followed. Was it a curse or just politics as usual? You can imagine the peasants muttering, "See, told you so," each time a royal cousin plunged a dagger into another. Further east, Hungarian legends tell of the Bathory family. Centuries before the infamous Countess Elizabeth, stories claimed that misfortune stalked their halls, with madness and violence woven into their lineage. When one child cried too loudly, or another grew sickly, neighbors would mutter that it wasn't just illness. It was the bloodline itself, tainted from the start. To be born a Bathory was to carry doom in your veins no matter what. It wasn't always kings and nobles who bore these burdens. Common families, too, could find themselves branded. So a farmer whose livestock always died, a widow whose children never thrived. Soon the entire family would be whispered about as cursed. Maybe it was witchcraft, maybe it was divine punishment. Either way, it stuck like a stain that no amount of prayer could wash away. And once that reputation took hold, no one wanted to trade with you, marry you, or even sit near you in church. Picture it. You're a child, sitting at the edge of a village feast. You laugh too loudly, spill your drink, and immediately someone mutters, "Ah, but they're from that cursed family." Suddenly, your whole life is shaped not by your choices, but by a story written long before you were born. It's the medieval equivalent of a bad Yelp review that you can never delete. The most unsettling part is how curses were often self-fulfilling. Fear isolates. Isolation breeds poverty. Poverty brings sickness, and sickness confirms the curse. A vicious loop, winding tighter with every generation. Historians still debate whether these curses were real beliefs or convenient ways for neighbors to explain misfortune or justify cruelty. Either way, once the word cursed was attached to your family name, it was nearly impossible to scrape off. You wander deeper into the night, and a hush seems to settle around you, the kind of silence that makes every creak of wood and sigh of wind sound like a warning. Plague omens. Those eerie little signs that whispered death was on its way before anyone sneezed or coughed. In the Middle Ages, people were desperate for meaning, and so every flicker of light, every odd sound, became a prophecy of doom. Picture yourself in a village at dusk. The sky glows orange, and suddenly a cloud formation looks suspiciously like a skeletal hand reaching down toward the rooftops. Children stare, mothers whisper, and by morning the gossip has spread. A hand in the sky means sickness is near. That's how fast fear traveled. Quicker than any rat, quicker than any flea. And honestly, in a world without weather apps, who could blame them? One of the most common omens was the mysterious ringing of invisible bells. People swore they heard ghostly chimes drifting through the night air, tolling for souls not yet dead. Sometimes they claimed the bells came from the sea, sometimes from beneath the earth. Historians still debate whether these were real sounds carried on the wind, or simply the brain's way of filling silence with dread. Either way, once the bells were heard, people prepared for graves to be dug. Then there were the animals, dogs howling without cause, cats arching their backs and hissing at nothing, flocks of birds scattering violently across the sky. All were read as signs that pestilence was already in motion. There's a particularly strange record from Germany, where villagers swore a herd of ghostly black pigs ran through the streets at night before the Black Death arrived. You can imagine the terror, pigs squealing, people screaming, and someone yelling, "Quick, close the doors!" As if wood and iron could stop death itself. Even comets became carriers of dread. When Halley's comet streaked across the sky, chroniclers scribbled feverishly that it glowed not with light but with poison dripping from its tail, ready to fall upon humanity. To them, celestial beauty was just cosmic foreshadowing of agony to come. Imagine the memes if medieval Twitter had existed. Or Comet of Death trending, stock up on garlic and prayers. Here's the chilling irony. Sometimes, these omens lined up perfectly with outbreaks, simply by chance. A strange eclipse followed by fever sweeping through a town. A dead crow nailed to a church door just days before people fell sick. Patterns that seemed undeniable, even if they were coincidences. Historians still debate whether belief in omens made plagues worse. Did fear weaken the body? Did panic spread faster than the disease itself? You sit by a fire in your mind's eye, listening to these tales as though the flames themselves might whisper the next sign. The embers crackle and you wonder, if you were living back then, would you notice a strange shadow, a sudden silence, and feel the shiver of prophecy down your spine? Or would you dismiss it as nothing? The truth is, in a world so fragile, every strange event felt like a messenger of death. The firelight flickers in your imagination, and suddenly you can almost hear the thunder of hooves pounding across the fields. The Black Riders, phantom horsemen said to appear before outbreaks of plague or famine, were the kind of legend that made the night itself feel like an enemy. You picture them cloaked in shadow, mounted on horses darker than midnight, moving so silently that only the trembling of the earth betrayed their passing. People swore they saw them sweeping through villages, never speaking, never pausing, just racing toward the next town already marked for suffering. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a dirt road as dusk bleeds into night. The air feels heavy, charged, and then hoofbeats. Not just one, but many, a whole company of riders. Their armor doesn't glint with torchlight. Instead, it seems to swallow light, pulling the world into deeper gloom. Some say their eyes burned red like coals. Others said they were hollow sockets empty as graves. Either way, no one ever dared to stand in their path. You step back, holding your breath, but of course it wouldn't matter. Death doesn't stop for courtesy. Historians still debate whether these legends came from sightings of real knights, mercenaries riding through to plunder villages under the cover of chaos, or simply fevered imaginations grasping for a form to pin their fear on. But to those who lived through the terror, the Black Riders weren't metaphors. They were as real as the plague pits that filled with bodies. One chilling variation describes the riders carrying long scythes, swinging them slowly as they galloped, slicing invisible fields of humanity instead of grain. Villagers said if the wind picked up suddenly, it was because the scythe had just passed, cutting down invisible stalks of life. Honestly, it sounds like the medieval version of Death's lawn care service, except the bill came in corpses. There's a record from Scandinavia of travelers seeing a wild hunt of black horsemen racing across the winter sky, their cries echoing like wolves. Was it aurora borealis refracted strangely? Or mass hysteria fueled by hunger and cold? Hard to say, but you can imagine lying awake in a wooden hut, hearing that ghostly thunder and praying it wouldn't circle back to your door. Some whispered that these horsemen were not bringers of plague, but collectors of souls already marked by fate. If a rider's shadow passed over your window, it meant someone inside would not survive the season. Families would scramble to light candles, to hang charms of iron and herbs, but deep down they knew. You couldn't outpace a horseman who never tired. And here's the irony. Whether or not anyone ever truly saw them, the Black Riders became a coping mechanism. It was easier to imagine a figure on horseback, than to accept that disease spread invisibly, silently, without reason. Better a rider you could picture than an enemy too small to see. Historians point out that legends like these gave structure to chaos, even if that structure was terrifying. You stand now on that road in your mind, the echo of hoofbeats still fading. The dust settles, but the dread remains, sinking into your bones like the chill of midnight. You realize that for medieval villagers, sleep itself was an act of courage, because who knew if the riders might thunder through while dreams left you defenseless? The sound of those hoofbeats lingers in your mind, but then it softens, morphing into something strangely rhythmic, like the shuffle of feet and the clatter of bones. The dance macabre. You can almost see it, a skeletal figure extending its bony hand, inviting you to join a line of dancers stretching across the world. Not the kind of dance party you'd RSVP to, but in the Middle Ages, this grim imagery was everywhere, on church walls, in manuscripts, even carved into gravestones. It was a reminder that no matter your station, peasant, knight, noble, or king, death was your most reliable dance partner. Imagine stepping into a candlelit chapel and seeing the fresco across the wall. A bishop in his ornate robes twirls hand in hand with a corpse wearing nothing but a grin. A merchant clutches his coin purse as a skeleton drags him into the line. Even children are there, skipping along beside their skeletal doubles, while a queen in a crown dips beneath a skeletal arm in an eternal waltz. It's equal parts grotesque and darkly funny, like death itself was mocking human pride. Historians still debate what sparked the obsession with this imagery. Was it the Black Death that killed millions, making mortality impossible to ignore? Or was it the trauma of endless wars and famines that made the idea of universal death both terrifying and strangely comforting? In either case, the dance macabre wasn't just art. It was a philosophy. Death comes for all, so don't get too smug about your title or your wealth. Think of it as medieval equality, only with more skeleton choreography. Some accounts describe processions held in real life, where actors dressed as skeletons would march through villages, pulling people from the crowd to join their dance. Can you imagine being dragged from the sidelines, told to jig alongside a rattling figure in a skull mask, all while your neighbors laughed nervously? Today we'd call it immersive theater. Back then it was both entertainment and sermon. The imagery wasn't entirely bleak, though. There was a strange kind of comfort in it. You standing barefoot in the mud could look at the painting and see the king himself being tugged along by the same skeletal hand. For once, you weren't the only one without power. Everyone ended up in the same line. In a world where inequality ruled everything else, death was the ultimate equalizer. And here's a detail that doesn't often make it into the textbooks: the music. Chroniclers mention that in some pageants, the dance macabre was accompanied by drums, flutes, or even bells, making the whole thing feel like a carnival of decay. Imagine a parade where the band never plays upbeat tunes, just slow, inevitable beats that sound suspiciously like your own heart thudding in your chest. Creepy, yes, but also weirdly catchy. You picture yourself being pulled into that line, your hand cold in the grip of bone, while behind you shuffle peasants, nobles, priests, and even children. The dance has no end, no release, just the circle closing in on itself night after night, century after century. And as the candles flicker, you wonder, maybe the whole point wasn't to terrify, but to remind people to live a little while they still could. After all, if death's already in the wings, you might as well enjoy the show before your turn comes. The silence after the dance is almost worse than the clatter of bones. You walk along a darkened path and the air feels thicker, heavier, like it's carrying voices you shouldn't hear. This is where the whispers begin. Tales of spirits that couldn't rest, souls doomed to wander the night roads and empty fields. Not skeletons in a dance this time, but something lonelier, more unsettling. You know the type. A shape glimpsed from the corner of your eye. A figure standing just a little too still under the trees. The one you convince yourself was never really there. In the Middle Ages, these weren't just spooky campfire stories. They were warnings. People believed the souls of the damned or unburied could not move on. If someone died suddenly without confession, or worse, if their body wasn't laid in consecrated ground, their spirit might linger, restless, resentful. Picture walking home from the tavern and seeing your neighbor, pale and silent, staring at you in the moonlight. Except you went to his funeral last week. Yeah, that's not just the ale talking. Historians still argue about how much of this was superstition versus social control. Some suggest these stories were crafted to keep people obedient, go to confession, pay for proper burial rites, keep the church happy, or risk becoming the next wandering soul. Others argue that they were ways of coping with grief, a way of explaining why the memory of the dead felt so alive, so close. Either way, the effect was the same. No one wanted to be outside alone at night, and here's a strange twist you probably didn't expect. In some places, villagers believed these restless spirits weren't just ghosts, they could physically harm the living. Not in the boo way, but in the very real sense of crops failing, animals dying, or sickness spreading through a household. To stop it, they sometimes dug up suspected restless corpses, staking them through the chest or removing their heads. Creepy, definitely. Effective? Well, historians still debate whether that was about ghosts or just pest control with extra steps. Picture a moonlit field, frost crunching underfoot, and a group of villagers shoveling furiously, muttering prayers, clutching torches. At the center of it all lies a body, exhumed with dirt clinging to its face. They drive a wooden stake through its ribs, the sound dull and final, as if pinning the spirit itself to the earth. Some swear the ground trembled when they did it. Others claim the night immediately grew calmer, like the air had exhaled. You tell yourself it's just nerves, but your skin still prickles. The legends varied. In England, they spoke of the restless dead who knocked on doors 3 times to summon victims. In Germany, it was the Nachzehrer, a corpse that supposedly chewed its burial shroud and drained life from its relatives above ground. And in Eastern Europe, well, let's just say the line between restless spirit and vampire was alarmingly thin. You can almost hear the whispers weaving these stories together across borders, each one shaped by local fears. You imagine lying in your bed at night, hearing the wind push against the shutters, and wondering if those were just branches scraping, or the faint knock of someone who should be 6 feet under. That thought alone is enough to keep you pulling the blanket tighter, even if it's scratchy wool that smells faintly of smoke. The whispers of wandering souls fade, but what replaces them is somehow worse. You see it in your mind's eye, the yawning mouth of hell itself, carved into church frescoes or scrawled into illuminated manuscripts with enough fire and teeth to fuel nightmares for centuries. Medieval artists really leaned into the whole terrify people into obedience theme. They painted hellmouths as giant beastly jaws, wide open, swallowing sinners whole. Picture a dragon crossed with a bear trap, lined with screaming faces. It's the kind of image you'd half expect to see on the side of a heavy metal album cover today. The sermons made sure no one forgot what those jaws represented. Priests would describe eternal torment in vivid detail, rivers of boiling pitch, demons with iron claws, souls roasted on spits like Sunday dinners. You sit there on a hard pew listening, and you can't help but imagine yourself tumbling headfirst into that mouth every time you sneeze during Mass. Seriously, you didn't need Netflix horror when Father Thomas was already running a one-man theater of fear. Here's the unnerving part. Hell wasn't just a faraway concept. It was used as leverage in daily life. Want peasants to pay their tithes? Remind them of the flames. Want wives to obey their husbands? Remind them of Eve and her eternal punishment. Want kids to stop stealing apples from the market? Whisper about the devil licking their toes at night. Historians still debate whether people truly lived in constant fear of damnation or whether they just learned to tune it out. The way you might ignore the same scary story told too often. But there were also strange, almost theatrical visions that spread like wildfire. Mystics claim to have walked through the fires of hell and returned, describing demons with wings like bats and eyes like burning coals. Some even drew maps, as if you could navigate eternal torment with a medieval GPS. Imagine someone saying, "Turn left at the boiling cauldron, continue past the screaming bridge, and your cousin Bernard is 3 pits down." Comforting, right? And the imagery wasn't all abstract. In the parish church, you'd see those paintings every week. Angels gently guiding the saved upward, while demons gleefully pitchforked the damned into monstrous mouths. Children grew up staring at them, absorbing the lesson before they could even read. It's like religious advertising, but with more teeth and flames. Still, the most terrifying thing wasn't the fire, it was the uncertainty. You could confess, repent, pray, and still not be sure you were safe. The line between salvation and damnation was painted as razor thin, and of course priests claimed they were the ones who could tip the balance. Historians still argue whether people genuinely feared eternal fire or whether fear of social shame, of being labeled a sinner, was the real control mechanism. Either way, the jaws stayed wide open, waiting. You picture it now. A fresco flickering in candlelight, the hellmouth glowing orange as if alive, painted demons looking far too enthusiastic about their work. The scent of incense does nothing to soften the image. You can almost feel the heat, hear the echo of wails from painted mouths, and when the priest finishes, you step outside into the cool night, grateful for the stars but glancing nervously at the shadows, just in case they move. The image of those painted jaws hasn't faded when another kind of dread creeps in. This one doesn't come from frescoes or sermons, but from the people who live right next to you. Witch hunts. The word alone is enough to make your shoulders tighten, because in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just a story. It was an ever-present possibility that the wrong look, the wrong word, the wrong herb in your basket could brand you a servant of the devil. Picture the scene: a village square at dusk, torches sputtering, a crowd buzzing with that peculiar mix of fear and excitement. At the center stands a woman. Maybe she's older, maybe widowed, maybe just outspoken. Someone's cow got sick. Someone's child took a fever, and suddenly she's the culprit. No evidence required, only suspicion. You hear the mutters. She stared too long at the butter churn. Her cat has odd eyes. Yeah, because heaven forbid a cat just be a cat. Here's the disturbing irony. Women who knew the most about healing, herbs, and childbirth were often the first accused. Their very skills, saving lives, were twisted into proof of dark dealings. Use rosemary for a fever. Witch. Deliver a baby safely when others had died. Witch. Bake bread that rose too well. Definitely witch. Historians still argue whether people truly believed these accusations, or whether witchcraft was a convenient scapegoat for the village's bad luck. Either way, it was deadly convenient. Trials were rarely about justice. They were theatre. Picture a trembling woman forced to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly without a stumble, because apparently God's ears doubled as a medieval spell check. If she faltered, guilty. Sometimes she'd be dunked in water, sink and drown, innocent. Float and survive, guilty. You can't win a game designed to kill you, and even when death didn't follow, the accusation itself could destroy a life. Neighbors would avoid you, goods went unsold, children whispered, doors shut in your face. Social exile was its own form of execution. The real bonfire wasn't the one with flames. It was the one of gossip, burning your name to ash long before the pyre. What makes it worse is how ordinary it all seemed. People brought their kids to watch, the way you might take yours to a fair today. Entertainment and morality play rolled into one. Can you imagine little Hans tugging on his mother's sleeve, asking for roasted chestnuts, while someone was being interrogated for speaking to her goat too kindly? Dark times indeed. You feel the weight of it, how fragile survival was. It wasn't just hunger or war that threatened you. It was the glance of a neighbor, the suspicion of a priest, the jealousy of a rival. A single word could undo everything. Historians still debate whether these hunts were widespread paranoia or isolated flare-ups, but for the women who lived under their shadow, it hardly mattered. Fear didn't need to be everywhere. It only needed to be possible. And so you walk home in this story, clutching your cloak tighter, avoiding eye contact, whispering prayers under your breath. You remind yourself, stay quiet, stay small, stay unnoticed. It's a survival tactic as old as fear itself. The whispers of witchcraft still cling to you, but before long they're drowned out by something heavier, darker, and far less picky about who it claims: the plague. The word itself feels like a tolling bell in your chest, doesn't it? You picture narrow medieval streets, the air heavy with rot and smoke, and the quiet knowledge that death has moved in and isn't planning to leave. It starts with the sound. Not a scream, not a curse, just the hacking cough that won't stop. Then the fever, then the swellings, black buboes rising under the skin like grotesque marbles. Within days, the strongest men are reduced to shivering wrecks, the healthiest children lie limp, and mothers whisper prayers that sound more like bargaining. You watch neighbors nail shut their own doors, too afraid to risk another visit. It's not just sickness. It's despair, a whole village unraveling. The strange thing is, no one agreed on what caused it. Some said bad air, miasma, poisoned by swamp vapors or planetary alignments. Others swore it was God's punishment, a divine audit of your sins. And then there were the darker accusations. Whispers that Jews poisoned wells, that witches cursed the fields, that strangers carried the rot in their clothes. Fear bred cruelty. Pogroms, executions, mobs hunting for scapegoats. Because if you can't fight a disease, you can always fight your neighbor, right? Here's a little-known fact that feels almost absurd. In some towns, doctors carried long sticks with flowers, herbs, or vinegar-soaked sponges stuffed into beak-like masks. They thought the smell would shield them from infection. From the outside, they looked like giant, sinister storks, except instead of bringing babies, they brought dread. Imagine running into one of them in a foggy alley at night. Better hope you had a change of underwear handy. And yet, for all the superstition, some measures worked almost by accident. Quarantines, 40 days of isolation in Venetian ports, helped slow the spread. Burning clothes and bedding sometimes curbed infection, but none of it felt like control. To live through plague years was to realize your life was a candle flickering in a draught, and at any moment, the wind could take it. Historians still debate the toll. Some say a third of Europe's population was wiped out. Others estimate even more. Think about that. Entire villages abandoned, fields left untended, churches echoing with the silence of prayers no one was left to say. For the survivors, it wasn't just the grief. It was the eerie quiet, the sense of being left behind in a world hollowed out. And yet, life clawed its way back. Children played again in the streets. Markets reopened. Bells rang for weddings instead of funerals. Humans are stubborn like that. We rebuild even when every reason says not to. Still, you can't shake the chill, knowing plague wasn't just a one-time horror. It came back again and again, like an unwelcome guest who never lost your address. You take a deep breath in this imagined past, the smell of herbs and smoke pressing into your nose, and you wonder what it must have been like to wake up each morning and count yourself among the lucky, still breathing, still here. You step through the haze of plague smoke into the looming silhouette of stone walls. Castles, those proud symbols of power, safety, and wealth, were never just about defense. They were also repositories of fear, steeped in stories that clung to the stones like ivy. Tonight, as the wind rattles through the battlements in your imagination, you find yourself wandering their corridors and realizing why the Middle Ages loved a good haunted castle tale. Picture yourself in a drafty hall, tapestries stirring with every hidden breeze. The fire pops, but it doesn't warm you. You hear footsteps echo across the flagstones, but the servants have long since gone to bed. Then comes the whisper, a sigh too soft to be the wind, too close to be imagined. Castles weren't just fortresses. They were theaters for ghost stories, especially when rooms carried memories of betrayal, murder, or restless grief. And trust me, medieval nobles weren't exactly shy about making enemies who might want to linger after death. Here's a little-known nugget for you. In some chronicles, ghost sightings weren't dismissed as imagination, but taken as evidence in disputes. If a murdered lord appeared in spectral form pointing toward his killer, people didn't say, "Oh, that's just indigestion." They sometimes treated it like testimony. Medieval courts of law might not have accepted your neighbor's gossip, but a ghost? Well, that was harder to argue against. One of the most chilling motifs was the White Lady, a spirit said to wander corridors, appearing before disaster struck the family. Was she a restless soul, or just a convenient way to explain the world falling apart? Historians still debate whether these tales reflected actual superstition or were tools of propaganda, meant to remind everyone that divine judgment could reach you even in your high tower, and the castles themselves didn't help. Narrow arrow slits made for moaning winds. Secret passages gave the impression of invisible movement. Torchlight flickered, shadows danced, and suddenly that armor standing in the corner wasn't just decor. It was a knight waiting to step forward. Imagine being a medieval guard, pacing stone floors at midnight with nothing but your own heartbeat and the sound of rats in the walls. Honestly, it was the medieval version of watching a horror movie alone at 2 a.m., except you didn't even have popcorn to make it better. Some castles were said to be cursed from their foundations. Built on ancient burial grounds, raised after bloody sieges, or haunted by workers who died during construction, they carried layers of dread. The story of Hauska Castle in Bohemia claimed it was built to seal a gateway to hell itself, complete with tales of winged creatures crawling out of a bottomless pit. Was it just Gothic exaggeration? Probably. But tell that to the guard standing night watch over a crack in the earth that supposedly led straight down to the underworld, yet there's another side to it. These haunted legends gave people a way to make sense of loss and tragedy. When a child died, when famine struck, when wars tore through, sometimes it was easier to blame the restless dead than accept the randomness of life. Ghosts were stories, and stories gave shape to fear. You pause in the great hall of your imagination, the air heavy with candle smoke and dread. You think about how fear has a way of echoing louder in big empty places, especially when you're already alone. Maybe that's why castles, for all their grandeur, often ended up feeling like mausoleums of stone, echo chambers where the past never really stayed. Quiet. And just as you start to wonder whether that sigh you hear is your own breath or something older, lingering behind you, the story pulls you forward, because beyond the haunted halls waits another layer of medieval terror. The demonic pacts and legends of those who dared to bargain with forces darker than death itself. You follow the thread of those whispers out of the castle and into something darker, stranger, and infinitely more unnerving. The idea that some people in the Middle Ages weren't just haunted, but actively bargaining with what haunted them. Demonic pacts, whispered deals in candlelit chambers, signatures not in ink, but in blood. This was the stuff that kept villagers clutching their rosaries at night. You picture a lonely scholar hunched over a desk, manuscripts spread before him, the only light a guttering tallow candle. He's muttering Latin phrases, not all of which make sense, and the room smells faintly of sulfur. The story always goes the same. Desperate for knowledge, wealth, or power, he reaches out to something beyond human, and something answers. The most famous of these tales would later inspire Faust, but the medieval world had its own prototypes, figures who supposedly summoned demons not for parlor tricks, but for survival in a brutal world. Here's a lesser-known fact that might give you a shiver. Some medieval grimoires, those so-called books of magic, weren't just written by obscure heretics. Copies were found in monasteries, tucked alongside theological works. Imagine a monk laboring over a manuscript that explained not just the Psalms, but also how to bind a demon into service with the right incense and invocations. Historians still debate whether these were earnest guides or theoretical warnings, but either way, the line between prayer book and spell book sometimes got thinner than a monk's hair shirt. The Devil's Pact became a way to explain sudden misfortune or sudden fortune. A farmer who went from poor to prosperous overnight? Clearly, he must have sold his soul. A woman whose herbs seemed too effective? She must have had help from below. The logic was simple and terrifying. Success outside the expected pattern was suspicious, and failure was proof you hadn't bargained hard enough. One story tells of Theophilus of Adana, a churchman who supposedly signed a contract with the devil to regain his lost position, only to later repent and be miraculously saved. The tale spread like wildfire in sermons, a warning wrapped in drama. Picture it. A parchment rolled out, a quill dipped in something darker than ink, and a trembling hand scratching out a signature while shadows gathered in the corners. It's equal parts courtroom drama and horror film, long before Hollywood ever thought of it. And people believed these contracts had weight. There were accounts of priests claiming to discover hidden pacts after someone died. Scraps of parchment, tucked into clothing or buried with bodies. Convenient, perhaps, for reminding everyone that the devil was always lurking with a pen ready. Whether those documents were real or fabricated hardly mattered. The fear was real, and it seeped into every corner of life. But here's the twist that makes you smirk in spite of yourself. While villagers feared these demonic deals, they also loved to gossip about them. Sitting around the fire, someone would whisper that the miller down the road was in league. And suddenly the man's skill at keeping his mill running through winter wasn't diligence, it was sorcery. Medieval rumor mills spun faster than TikTok trends, and the devil was the ultimate clickbait. You imagine yourself listening to one of these tales on a winter's night, the fire low, the wind rattling the shutters. Every creak sounds like a claw scratching at the door, every flicker of flame like a red eye watching. And you realize why these legends lasted. They made the invisible anxieties of daily life visible. Poverty, injustice, envy, ambition. They all became characters in a play where the devil was just waiting backstage with a contract and a grin. As you breathe out, letting the imagined sulfur clear from your mind, you sense the story tilting toward its next shadow. Because if demonic pacts terrified the imagination, nothing shook medieval hearts more than the idea that hell itself could erupt into the world in the form of fire, brimstone, and apocalyptic visions. The whisper of demonic contracts still lingers in your ears, but now the fear expands, swelling into something grander and hotter. The spectre of hell itself bursting through the seams of the world. Fire was not just a punishment in sermons. It was the living metaphor of divine wrath. And for medieval minds, it was never too far away. You imagine standing in a crowded church, smoke from torches curling in the rafters, while a priest's voice thunders about eternal damnation. He paints vivid pictures, lakes of fire, demons with claws like hooks, souls roasted on spits as if hell itself were a grotesque kitchen. Children clutch their mothers, grown men bow their heads, and you feel the chill of the stone floor, even as the words make you sweat. It's theatre, grim, relentless theatre, and everyone's ticket is mandatory. Here's a chilling detail. Medieval mystery plays often dramatized hell right in the town square. Stagehands would build a hellmouth, a massive wooden dragon's head with gaping jaws, painted red and black, from which smoke and sparks poured as actors in horned masks dragged sinners inside. Imagine it. Neighbors dressed as demons yanking your friend off stage while the crowd gasped and laughed nervously. Historians still debate whether these plays were meant more to terrify or to entertain, but either way they burned fiery images into the minds of everyone watching. And sometimes, fire wasn't just theatre, it was real. Cities with wooden houses and thatched roofs could go up in flames with terrifying speed. Chroniclers described great fires as punishments from heaven, divine warnings made visible. For women accused of heresy or witchcraft, flames became both stage and execution. You can't separate hell from the world when you've seen someone tied to a stake. The fire devouring not just her body but her name. A curious twist. In some medieval manuscripts, hell wasn't pictured as a vast burning pit at all. Sometimes it was a frozen wasteland, a place of eternal ice where sinners were trapped, gnawed by frost instead of flames. The geography of damnation shifted, depending on who was telling the story, which proves that hell wasn't just a doctrine, it was a canvas for imagination, painted in colors of fear. And yet, in quieter corners, you catch another current. Some mystics wrote of visions where hell was less about physical torment and more about distance from God. A loneliness so profound, it felt like endless night. That idea almost feels scarier, doesn't it? To be utterly forgotten, stripped not by flames but by absence. Picture yourself leaving that sermon, stepping back into the daylight. The fields stretch out before you, ordinary and green, but your eyes still sting from the imagined smoke. Every shadow under a tree seems deeper, every flicker of torchlight sharper. You know it's not hell itself, but the fear clings, reminding you how fragile the boundary feels. And just when you think the fire has cooled, another chill runs down your spine. Because if hell could burst upward, the medieval mind also believed heaven could send signs downward. Omens in the sky, celestial warnings etched across the stars. Aren't those fiery lights in the heavens? They weren't always seen as beautiful. They could be terrifying. The memory of fire fades, but your eyes are drawn upward now, to the heavens where strange lights streak and shimmer. For medieval villagers, the night sky wasn't just a backdrop of stars. It was a canvas of messages, painted by hands they could neither predict nor control. And every unusual glow could mean disaster was waiting to crash down. You imagine standing in a muddy square at twilight, neck craned as a fiery ball tears across the sky. A comet. To us, it might just be an astronomical event, something you'd snap on your phone and post with a hashtag. But to them, it was a screaming omen. The bright tail was a sword, they said, wielded by heaven itself, ready to slice through kingdoms. Kings feared comets as harbingers of death, peasants whispered about plagues, and priests thundered from pulpits that sin was written across the sky. Here's a strange little fact. In 1066, the year of the Norman conquest, Halley's comet blazed bright. Chroniclers insisted it foretold the death of King Harold, struck down at Hastings. Found when it reappeared centuries later, some scribes still described it as the hairy star, a celestial beast dragging doom behind it. Historians still debate whether these interpretations shaped events. Did comets cause fear, or did fear make people twist every event into proof? But comets weren't the only heavenly terrors. Solar eclipses turned day into night, sending crowds into prayerful panic. To stand in sudden darkness at noon, hearing animals cry out and children wail, must have felt like the end of the world creeping in. Imagine the terror, the sun itself, that daily lifeline, swallowed whole. Some said it was God's hand pulling a veil. Others swore it was dragons devouring the light. Either way, you wouldn't be calm enough to admire the corona. And then there were the auroras. Imagine ribbons of red and green dancing above your village, flickering like flames in the sky. Today we'd call them the northern lights and call it beautiful. Back then, they were ghost armies, angels battling demons or the souls of the restless dead spilling across the heavens. It's no wonder people dropped to their knees, convinced the final trumpet was about to sound. The irony is, for all the terror, these celestial signs also created awe. People didn't just fear the sky, they felt connected to it. Every comet, every eclipse, every shimmering light was proof that the universe was alive, speaking in a language of fire and shadow. And in that awe there was a strange comfort too. Maybe the world wasn't indifferent. Maybe it was watching. You lower your gaze at last, blinking away the after-images. The village looks the same, but nothing feels secure. If the stars themselves can't be trusted, where can safety possibly live? And just as that thought digs into your bones, another rumor reaches your ears. Stories not of the sky, but of beasts that prowled the earth. Creatures so strange and terrifying they blurred the line between myth and memory. The whispers settle into your bones as you leave behind the terror of the skies, only to meet the monsters said to walk upon the earth. Not just wolves howling in the forest, but creatures of nightmare. Half myth, half memory, woven into the fabric of medieval fears. You step carefully because in this world, even shadows might have teeth. You imagine a torchlit gathering where villagers huddle close, retelling the tale of the beast of Gévaudan centuries before it even earned its name. Huge wolves, they say, with eyes glowing like embers, capable of slaughtering whole flocks in a night. And if wolves weren't terrifying enough, storytellers added claws like razors, hides that shrugged off arrows, and hunger that never ceased. For peasants whose livelihoods depended on sheep and cattle, such stories weren't just entertainment, they were survival guides. Cautionary warnings disguised as legend. Here's a strange little fact. Medieval bestiaries didn't just describe animals, they moralized them. A wolf wasn't just a predator, it was a metaphor for sin, a living sermon about greed and cunning. And let's be honest, if you'd seen a real wolf dragging away your only goat, you'd agree it symbolized evil just fine. Historians still debate how much of these accounts were based on real predators and how much was exaggerated fear. But the fear itself? That was very real. And then there were dragons. Not the sleek, fire-breathing icons you see in movies, but lumbering, serpent-like horrors that supposedly dwelled in caves, swamps, or remote hills. Some said they had wings, others claimed they slithered like giant snakes. Knights sought them out for glory, but for ordinary people the dragon was a shorthand for the unknown. A thunderstorm tearing across the sky? A dragon's wings? A sudden illness? Its breath? A collapsed barn? Its tail striking the earth? You'd almost feel sorry for the poor lizards, blamed for everything. Almost. But it wasn't just beasts outside the walls. It was shapeshifters too. Stories of werewolves whispered from one village to the next. Men cursed to turn into wolves under the full moon, doomed to feast on their neighbors. Picture the fear. You're sitting by the fire and suddenly you wonder if the man beside you, the same one who traded onions with you that morning, will sprout fur and fangs by nightfall. Even the church chimed in, warning that such curses were signs of Satan's influence. Superstition and morality tangled together until suspicion itself became a kind of monster. And don't forget the water. Rivers, lakes, and wells were said to be home to spirits, sometimes fair and luring, sometimes dark and devouring. Tales of women pulled beneath the water by pale hands weren't just bedtime stories. They were warnings to keep children away from dangerous currents. A clever mix of safety advice and bone-deep terror. The truth is, these monsters filled the silence of the dark, explained the unexplainable, and gave shape to the fears that haunted every corner of medieval life. In a world where disease, famine, and war were constant, the imagination turned ordinary dangers into legends, and in doing so it created a library of nightmares that still flicker through our stories today. So now, as the last echoes of hoofbeats, comets, and dragons fade into the night, let your breath slow. The legends have been terrifying, yes, But they are only shadows now, soft and harmless in the quiet of your room. The flicker of your lamp feels steadier than any medieval torch, the hum of your fan calmer than any forest silence. You are safe, wrapped not in superstition but in the steady embrace of the present. Close your eyes and let the weight of those centuries drift away. Imagine the stars above, not as omens, but as quiet companions glimmering far beyond fear. Imagine the monsters retreating into mist, leaving you only with the echo of stories softened at the edges. Your breath deepens, your body sinks heavier into the bed. The Middle Ages were harsh, strange, and terrifying, but tonight you are not there. You are here, resting, breathing, carried gently into sleep. Let the legends dissolve into silence. Let your mind unfurl into calm, and drift as though rocked by the slow tide of history itself. And as your eyelids grow heavy, let the storyteller's voice fade into a whisper, promising only peace. End of script. Sweet dreams.